Part of what I'm going to talk about actually involves the sort of relative lack of volatility in this recent year. But okay, so I want to thank Martha for inviting me. I want to thank Modern Greek Studies and all the other organizations and units on campus that made all this possible. And I wanted also to express how nice it is for me to be back at a Cal State campus. I taught at Cal State Northridge for 4 years, and I'm a native Coloradan, as I'll discuss a little bit more later on in my talk. But I have a lot of nostalgia for my time at the Cal States. Right now, when I look out at my students and when I walk across campus at Boulder, I find myself missing the variety of all sorts that is such a hallmark of the Cal State system. And so it's really nice to be back at, at least a Cal State. So what I want to talk about today are some really preliminary reflections on commemorations surrounding Ludlow during this year. They're preliminary for two main reasons. One is that as today's colloquium evidences, these commemorations are still very much in process. And secondly, I'm not very quick. I'm a muller, and I'm much more of a kind of writer and rewriter again than I am somebody who's very good at thinking on my feet. And so it'll probably take me several years till I actually have anything very insightful to say about what's happened this year, and I may not even get there. But in any case, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about my experiences in the past year, mostly in the Colorado context, with a whole suite of commemorations surrounding Ludlow. And I think that at this point, when we look at historical scholarship more broadly, or if we even look at humanistic scholarship more broadly, there's so much excellent work there. There's so much excellent work out there on historical memory. And much of that work focuses on profound miscarriages of historical memory. So I'm thinking here most notably of works like David Blight's Race and Reunion on Civil War memory, and how emancipationist memories of the Civil War were essentially trumped by white supremacist visions and visions that emphasize sectional reconciliation over what the Civil War had really become by 1863, which is a war to free the slaves, a war for freedom. More recently and closer to Colorado, I think of Ari Kelman's work, A Misplaced Massacre, on the Sand Creek Massacre, the 150th anniversary of which falls next month. And Colorado has an unfortunate history of massacres, right? Sand Creek, Ludlow, Columbine in 1927, the more recent Columbine massacre, the Aurora theater shootings, and the U Wars. We could kind of go on and on. What these recent works on historical memory tend to emphasize is what a bad job people have typically done in commemorating the past, and the ways in which efforts to arrive at some sort of public memory about contentious events in the American past have engendered forgetting, purposeful suppression of the past, and how all the ways in which memory has served to kind of reinforce the status quo. So, in this context, then, I think we can see that previous instances of American commemoration of public memory have set a pretty low bar. But measured up against that low bar, I think that the Centennial commemorations in Colorado and in places like San Francisco have actually been pretty good. I think that this has actually been a pretty successful year for historical memory. I wouldn't really put this maybe on par with something like, Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial. It's not kind of that level of success where we have, sort of very, a landscape feature, an architectural feature, something that has a kind of permanence that none of our commemorations held this year will probably have. But still, I think that this year has actually been a fairly cheerful instance of a tragic American event largely receiving its due in a manner that, on the whole, has been sincere, thoughtful, respectful, and within the limits of public discourse in this country, quite probing. Then again, I'm pretty biased on this count because I was a member of the organization that oversaw many of these commemorations, which was something called the Ludlow Centennial Commission. And so I want to talk a little bit about the work of the commission, give you a few reflections on things that we did and things that I experienced over the course of the year. And then I want to end with a few attempts to kind of make sense of of why I think this was so far this has actually been a relatively successful Centennial. So this was a commission that was organized by, well, it was actually a commission that was organized on a fairly grassroots level by mostly people coming out of Pueblo. So, Pueblo is the steel town where Colorado Fuel and Iron long produced steel, and it's where a lot of the coal from Los Animas County in particular went. That coal was turned into coke, and that coke was fed into the giant Pueblo steel mills. And Pueblo is the largest town in southern Colorado at this point. There's a campus there of Colorado State University, and several historians there, initially led by John Reese, but then Fawn Amber Montoya kind of took up the torch, started preparations a couple years ago, really, to create a Ludlow Centennial Commission. They started partnering fairly early on with History Colorado, which is the sort of, newfangled Colorado Historical Society. So the commission was sort of created and then presented to the governor as a fait accompli that then he would sort of sanction. And this was a good strategy because the governor probably wouldn't have had the time or the energy or the inclination to put such a commission together in his own right. And this was a commission that had a couple dozen members. It was a fairly kind of flexible membership, but it included academic historians such as myself, public historians, archaeologists, Dean Seda in particular, but there are also representatives from the United Mine Workers, the Greek Orthodox Church, and also quite a few people from various performing arts groups and Southern Colorado foundations. So it's a big and quite interesting mix of people. And I think that the membership of the commission is one key to its relative success. This is a commission that was quite inclusive in terms of its membership on all sorts of counts. And I think that this was a commission that in a lot of ways reflected the breadth and scope of Coloradans who care deeply about Ludlow. And I think that the way that the commission went about conducting its work was very practical. And this was a flexible commission. It was a commission that largely functioned as a kind of coordinating body. So local groups would host events, and the commission would try to make sure that there weren't conflicts, would share the expenses to bring speakers like Scott Martell out to Colorado and put together junkets so that he could go to different communities where the resources in southern Colorado in particular are very slim. These are places where you can't, it's hard to scratch up $200, let alone enough to fly somebody out and put them up and pay the incredibly generous commission that the honoraria that we mostly weren't paying. The what?
It covered the bar bill.
It covered the bar bill. Well, that's all you need. That's all you need. There's really good leadership too of the organization. Fawn Amber Montoya from CSU Pueblo, Don DePrince from History Colorado, and so I think this was a commission that on the whole was practical, constructive, and did its work in quite a democratic manner. And I think that in a lot of ways, actually, this was a commission that I sound so self-congratulatory. Let me put this in context, since I'm a historian. I've been teaching, I've been teaching this semester, and this has been one of those semesters where I feel like all I have to say is very negative stuff. I've been teaching about Reconstruction and the spate of massacres in the American South, and I'm so happy to have a story that feels slightly positive to me. That if I'm overdoing it, that's kind of the context for why I'm doing that. But I think that in a lot of ways, this commission was a showcase for all that's admirable about the American civic tradition. This was voluntaristic. This was, local organizations working together. Unfortunately, resources were very scarce, but this also meant that it wasn't a commission that really had to answer to anyone. The state wasn't giving us any money, so the state had no say in what we were doing, really. And I think that, because this commission ended up honoring what's good about American civic traditions, I think in a lot of ways it was actually a commission that unintentionally, but importantly, ended up honoring the cause for which the martyrs of Ludlow died in terms of the structures and the procedures. And over the course of the year, the commission sponsored, which is really too much, sort of oversaw and loosely coordinated dozens of events, literally dozens of events in every corner of Colorado. These included plays, museum exhibits, symposia, rallies, memorial services, lectures, an Easter Mass by the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan, at the Ludlow site. And of course, all of these things engendered conversations. And so for me, this was a really memorable slate of activities. And on the whole, it was a sort of obvious choice, but the commission chose to try to map the activities onto the rough chronology of the strike. And so things began, the sort of year's events began last September in Trinidad, where the strike began, with the march, which is how the strike began. And so, I think in a lot of ways this has been good. In terms of the highlights for me, there have been a lot of chances to work with teachers. And for me, this is especially significant because, as I said earlier, I was born and raised in Colorado. I'd never heard of the Ludlow Massacre until I was in graduate school in a U.S. history program at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And, for me, one of the things that struck me very early on about Ludlow and historical memory is that it's an event that locally, both in southern Colorado, memories of Ludlow, circa the late 90s, early 2000s, were very segmented. And so I think people in southern Colorado certainly remembered it. A lot of them had family ties to it, of course. Whether they were willing to talk about it or not was another question. Once you got up to Denver, Boulder, where I grew up, people on the whole didn't know about it and didn't really want to talk about it. Then in terms of national memory, things were somewhat different on sort of the left. On the liberal left, Ludlow's been important, of course, since 1914, since these events happened. But within American memory more broadly, I think it's largely a sort of occluded event. But for me, working with teachers in Colorado has been a really great way to try to sort of change what brought me to Ludlow in the first place. Was to some extent just the sort of why didn't I learn about this? Why did I have to get so far through a very specialized graduate program in history to find out about something that happened very close to me and that should have really appealed to me. So working with teachers has been great. One of the things that I was able to do this year was to put together a resource set of primary source documents that K through 12 teachers could modify for use in their own classrooms. And so this is something that is going to be taught much more easily, I think, because of a number of efforts along those lines. Next Saturday, I'm leading a bus trip down to Trinidad and Ludlow with a bunch of teachers from the Denver area. So I think this is great. But beyond that, there's sort of two events that really stick out for me. One was the Centennial commemoration held by the United Mine Workers at Ludlow in May. And, wonderful speakers, just an incredible atmosphere, but the highlight was listening to Cecil Roberts. And if you haven't seen Cecil Roberts speak, the man is a force. He's the president of the UMWA, and it's kind of like a time warp. Sad to say, because when you watch Cecil Roberts speak, he's a man who quite literally has the old-time Union religion. Incredibly inspiring, incredibly eloquent, and you feel he's like a sort of there's a kind of he's sort of like a touchstone in this really interesting way. Just to Mother Jones would be very proud of Cecil Roberts. I think he's sort of the one of the real living descendants of her. And so seeing him talk about Ludlow and its significance was just an amazing treat. Another moment that sticks out for me came, I think, the day after that, which was a representative from Southern Colorado introduced a resolution in the Colorado State Legislature. And that resolution, which I have here, a kind of torn up copy, and it's quite long, so I won't read it, but it's a resolution basically acknowledging the event as a massacre and acknowledging the state's culpability in the events in the Ludlow massacre. And to be there in the State House and to have this resolution read, which culminates actually with the reading of the names of the dead and their ages, was very powerful. This was a moment of sort of official recognition of Ludlow on the Colorado stage that I think had largely been denied to it. So I think in a lot of ways, this was a successful slate of events. Ludlow was not forgotten, not this year, not this year. And the massacre and the larger struggle in which it occurred have also been commemorated on larger levels, of course, as this symposium shows and as Polikari demonstrates. Right, this has been even an international event in some important ways. And this year of events has been marked by, on the whole, a notable lack of controversy. Yeah. And so what I want to talk about next is a few thoughts about whether this is a good thing or not. Personally, I only really encountered two main instances of what I would call, sort of reaction. Yeah. One came from a talk I gave, it was a panel at History Colorado in Denver, where where there was this angry radical from Colorado Springs wearing the red bandana neck chief, associated with the rednecks, which is what the strikers often referred to themselves in 1913-14. He was very critical that we were giving kind of too much of a whitewash on Ludlow, and that we needed to give kind of a more leftist take on it. And then the other thing was something that Scott was more centrally involved in. I kind of got sucked into it tangentially, which was
collateral damage.
Yeah, collateral damage, right? Which was a symposium at CSU Pueblo. Part of that was a conversation with one of the Costa descendants, right? Yeah, and then I mean, where I got kind of dragged in was on I guess it was really a blog, a set of blog postings on the Labor and Working Class History Association thing that, sort of started equating Scott's work and mine, and kind of flattening everything out. And
they assigned my sins to you. So.
Well, and it ended up being kind of maybe an all too typical academic controversy, where there was not really a lot of light shed in the course of this whole thing. I mean, on the whole, I think there's really been a surprising degree of concurrence about what happened in 1913-14, why it matters today. And in some ways, this is okay with me. I think I come from the Midwestern part of Colorado, in that I'm not a very conflictual person. I don't really like to argue with people that much. As a slow muller, oral confrontations tend to leave me defeated. So maybe it's that. But still, there's something about this that makes me a little nervous, I have to confess. There's this sort of, when you have a string of events about a controversial event that, on the whole, have been instances largely of consensus, I get a little uncomfortable. And so I want to just end by talking a little bit about why this might be. I think part of this is just that enough time's passed. 100 years have passed. There's no longer people living who, directly participated in these events. The world has changed enough that I think people don't feel like they have a dog in this fight in quite the way that they did, even 30 years ago. The coal industry has left southern Colorado almost entirely. So you can criticize king coal in Colorado quite easily, which is something that you still can't do in, say, Kentucky or West Virginia very safely. Organized labor is on the ropes, of course, across the country, but Colorado has been a so-called right-to-work state really since Ludlow. And so there's not much of a local labor movement. There's not a lot of employer fear of organized labor in Colorado. And Colorado's Democratic Party, led by the likes of John Hickenlooper, the governor who sanctioned the commission, is very moderate. They've sort of led the charge to the center. Like many other Western Democrats, they realize that the rightward turn of the Republican Party has left a huge vacuum in the middle, and they've very astutely filled that moderate role. And so, I think for the Democratic Party in Colorado, they really don't have much interest in organized labor. They don't see it as especially relevant, and so the controversies surrounding Ludlow don't really have a lot of public purchase at this point. But I think more recent events, particularly events in the last month in Colorado, make me wonder whether this isn't actually just an accident of timing. Because the year calendar of Ludlow commemoration, on the whole, has stayed outside of the American election season. And what's happening now in Colorado, and in particular I want to refer to the controversies over the teaching of American history in Jefferson County, which is immediately west of Denver. It's this county that extends from the inner ring suburbs, which are the new American inner city, up to the foothill exurbs above. In Jefferson County, and this is a district actually where I worked over the course of many summers, working with teachers for a Teaching American History grant program, the school board has taken a rightward turn new conservative members receiving money from Cook Brother funded PACs and so forth have come into office, and they've tried to restrict teachers' ability to teach the new AP US history curriculum. And so they proposed a plan last month to establish a committee that would review the district's AP US history curriculum. And what they want to do, and I'm quoting here both from the document and from a Washington Post article on it, is that they want to review the curriculum to, quote, promote patriotism and avoid encouragement of civil disorder, social strife, or disregard of the law. According to the original plan, the district's history curriculum should promote citizenship, patriotism, essentials and benefits of the free enterprise system, respect for authority, and respect for individual rights. And so, you know, I mean, it's very, very clear that the right-wing newcomers to the Jefferson County School Board don't subscribe to the kind of patriotism that Elliott Gorn so rightly embraced this morning. You know, and that kind of you know, these are flag-waving strikers, right? This is a flag-waving, thoroughly American labor movement, but that's not the patriotism that the Jefferson County School Board wants to be taught in these schools. This is a school board that I don't think would look kindly upon the sorts of efforts that that others drew this morning between early 20th century Colorado coal mining and fracking, which remains an extraordinarily contentious issue, not just in Pennsylvania, of course, but in Colorado today. And so I think that, you know, sort of the ways in which the year's commemorations have gone off successfully have also, you know, I mean, there's partly the accident of timing that this was outside of the election season and thus did not become politicized in the way that everything does between, you know, say June and November of even-numbered years. But it's also because I think in a lot of ways Ludlow has been sort of, in public discourse in Colorado was, you know, partly because of, probably partly because of some of our Midwestern tendencies and fears of, you know, NRA folks in the audience and all of that. Maybe we sort of avoided some of the more contentious parts of this history. And so, like I said, I'm a muller, so I'm not really quite sure what all this adds up to. But I wanted to give you kind of a progress report both on the commemorations of this year and my attempt to try to figure out what all of this means. So, thank you.